The day Hargrove Capital sent 3 people to his shop, Brendan Osei was elbow-deep in a 1968 Pontiac Firebird that a retired schoolteacher from Sudbury had driven 6 hours to have restored. He heard the door open. He didn't look up. "We're closed to walk-ins," he said. "You need an appointment, Mr. Osei." The voice was smooth, measured, the kind of voice that had never once asked for anything. It simply stated expectations. "My name is Victoria Hargrove. I think you know who I am." He did. Everyone in Kenora did. Brendan wiped his hands on his shop rag and straightened up. Victoria Hargrove was standing in the center of his garage floor like she owned it already. Navy blazer, leather portfolio under one arm, 2 men in suits flanking her like decorative pillars. She was looking around at his bays, his lift, his walls lined with tools hung in the same order his father had arranged them 30 years ago. She was looking the way people look at things they've already decided to take. "What can I do for you?" Brendan asked. "Actually," she said, "it's what we can do for you." Brendan Osei was 47 years old. He'd grown up in the back of this same shop, doing homework on the parts counter while his father, Kwame, rebuilt carburetors and talked hockey with customers. Kwame had come to Kenora from Accra in 1978 with $200, a mechanical engineering certificate, and the kind of stubbornness that either builds something or breaks a man. It built something. Osei Restoration had become one of the most respected small automotive shops in northwestern Ontario. Not because it was cheap, but because Brendan and his father before him did the work properly the first time every time. Brendan's wife, Joelle, had died of an aneurysm 8 years ago on a Tuesday morning in October, while she was drinking coffee and reading the local paper at the kitchen table. Their son, Theo, their son Devin was 11 at the time. Now Devin was 19, studying mechanical engineering at Lakehead and coming home every summer to work the shop floor alongside his dad. It was the same path Brendan had walked. He never asked Devin to follow it. Devin just did. That was the thing about this shop. It had a gravity to it. Victoria Hargrove wanted to buy it, not the business, not the goodwill. She wanted the land. Hargrove Capital had been moving through the Kenora waterfront district for 2 years, buying up properties, assembling what local rumor called a mixed-use hospitality corridor, boutique hotels, high-end marina facilities, a planned wellness resort. The shop sat on a corner lot directly between 2 properties Hargrove had already acquired. It was, as her portfolio made clear with full-color renderings, a gap in her plans. "The offer is fair," she said, "more than fair. You could retire, Mr. Osei. You could set your son up completely." "My son is set up," Brendan said. "He's going to run this shop someday." Victoria Hargrove nodded slowly as though he'd said something slightly naive. "Think about it," she said, setting a card on the parts counter. "But don't think too long. Timelines move." After they left, Brendan stood in the silence of his shop for a long time. The Firebird sat waiting. Outside, the September light was going gold over the lake. He picked up her card, he set it back down, he went back to work. The first letter arrived 6 weeks later. It was from the town of Kenora's municipal licensing office, informing Osei Restoration that a complaint had been filed regarding the operation of a commercial automotive business in a zone undergoing mixed-use reassessment. An inspection was being scheduled. Brendan read it twice. He'd been operating under the same commercial zoning for 22 years. He called the licensing office. The woman on the phone was polite and told him the process was routine. The inspection happened on a Thursday. 2 inspectors arrived with clipboards and walked the property for 90 minutes. They noted a crack in the concrete apron at the rear of the building. They noted that his parts washing unit, purchased and certified 4 years ago, predated a regulatory update by 8 months. They noted an inadequate secondary containment tray beneath one of his oil storage drums, a drum that had been in the same position, fully compliant since 2019. The report that came back recommended a remediation order and a 45-day compliance window. Brendan had a contractor look at the apron. He was told it would cost roughly $12,000 to repair and resurface. He started the paperwork to replace the parts washer. He moved the drum and ordered a new containment system. Then, before the 45 days were up, a second letter arrived. This one wasn't from the licensing office. It was from Hargrove Capital's legal team, informing him that as a result of the open municipal remediation order against the property, his commercial lease, which he held on the portion of the lot that sat on town-owned land, was now in technical breach. Hargrove Capital, the letter explained, had recently acquired the adjacent property that held the reversionary interest in that lease arrangement. They were formally exercising the breach clause. Brendan sat at the kitchen table that night and read the letter 4 times. Then he called his son. Devin drove up from Thunder Bay that weekend. He sat across the table and read through everything. The inspection report, the remediation order, the lease agreement, the Hargrove letter. He was quiet for a long time. "She manufactured this," Devin said. "I know. The complaint that triggered the inspection, I know, Devin, Dad." Devin looked up. She bought the reversionary interest specifically to use this clause. That's not a coincidence. That's a plan. Brendan nodded. He already understood this. He'd understood it the moment Victoria Hargrove had walked into his shop and looked at it the way people look at things they've already decided to take. He just hadn't moved fast enough. He called a lawyer. The lawyer, a woman named Phyllis Garner, who had practiced property and commercial law in Kenora for 30 years, confirmed what Devon had said. The lease breach, while legally arguable, would likely cost more to fight in the short term than the shop could sustain. And the remediation order was real, whatever its origins, and that meant the clock was running on the compliance window. You could fight it, Phyllis said, but they'll slow-walk any appeal, 6-8 months minimum. Can you operate under these conditions for that long? Brendan looked around his shop, looked at the Pontiac Firebird finally finished, gleaming under the shop lights, looked at the wall of tools, looked at the framed photograph above the parts counter. His father, Kwame, standing in front of this same building in 1984, hands on his hips, grinning like the whole world was just getting started. I don't know, he said. The compliance costs came faster than expected. The contractor found more damage beneath the apron, subsurface heaving from freeze-thaw, which was nobody's fault and everybody's problem in northwestern Ontario. The repair estimate climbed to $22,000. The new parts washer was on back order. A customer whose car he'd promised for October had to be pushed to December, and that customer told 2 people, and that was how reputations start to fray. In November, the town issued a partial stop work order pending completion of the remediation. Brendan could still operate the restoration bays, but he couldn't do any commercial mechanical work. Oil changes, repairs, the bread-and-butter jobs that kept on restoration projects. Revenue dropped by 60% overnight. Victoria Hargrove's assistant called in December. Very polite. Just checking in to see if Mr. Osei had given any further thought to their offer. Brendan hung up. He spent Christmas with Devon in the house his wife had painted yellow the summer before she died. They didn't talk about the shop much. They watched hockey. They made the jerk chicken recipe that Kwame had brought from Accra and Joelle had learned from him and that now lived, written on a recipe card in Joelle's handwriting, inside a kitchen drawer that Brendan hadn't reorganized since she died. They ate at the kitchen table with the paper still folded on the chair where she used to sit. On Boxing Day, Devon asked, "What are you going to do?" Brendan thought about it for a long time. "I'm going to find another way," he said. "The offer, not the offer." Devon looked at him. Then the Prue property had been sitting empty for 11 years. It was a former light industrial building on the eastern edge of town, a sheet metal fabrication facility that had closed in 2013 when the company moved its operations to Winnipeg. The building was concrete block and steel, about 12,000 square feet, on a 2-acre lot with loading dock access and a rail spur that hadn't been used since the 90s. The roof had been resealed in 2018 as part of a failed revitalization effort. Otherwise, it had just been sitting. The estate that owned it had been trying to sell it for years. The price had come down 3 times. Nobody in Kenora wanted an industrial building that size. The town was too small and the carrying costs were too high. Brendan had driven past it 100 times without seeing it. He saw it for the first time in January on a Sunday afternoon when he took a long drive just to think. He pulled over, he sat in his truck and looked at the building for a long time. He called Devon that night. "I know what that building is," Devon said immediately. "Yeah? It's a restoration facility. Proper one, not a 3-bay shop, an actual floor. You could do 3 or 4 builds simultaneously, climate-controlled, spray booth, fabrication area." A pause. "Dad, you could do what you've always talked about. The real stuff, the concours work." Brendan had always done good work, but there was a tier above good that he'd never quite had the space or equipment to reach. The show-level restorations, the full rotisserie builds, the cars that went to Barrett Jackson and brought 6 figures. He knew how to do that work. He'd apprenticed under a man in Hamilton who did it 25 years ago. He just hadn't ever had the right facility. He asked Phyllis Garner to look into the Prue property. The estate wanted $420,000. The building needed electrical upgrades, an updated ventilation system for a proper spray booth, and a floor reinforcement in one section. Devon drew up an estimate over 2 weeks of evenings. Total build-out cost, assuming Brendan did as much of the labor himself as possible and called in favors from every tradesperson he'd ever helped, would be somewhere around $230,000. Brendan had been putting money away his entire adult life. He and Joelle had lived carefully, spent carefully, and he'd kept saving after she was gone because he didn't know what else to do with the instinct. He had equity in the house, he had savings, he did not have enough. He sat down with his bank manager, a man named Gerald. No, someone different, a man named Ray Coulomb who had known Brendan for 15 years. Ray walked him through his options. There was a federal small business development loan program that could cover a portion of the gap. There was a Northern Ontario Economic Development Grant for industrial property revitalization. The Prue building might qualify. There would still be a financing gap of somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000, depending on how the property appraisal came back. It's tight, Ray said. I know, Brendan said. But your business history is clean. Your financials are solid. I think we can put this together. They worked on it for 6 weeks. The grant application took 3 of those weeks to complete. Phyllis negotiated the purchase price down to $395,000 based on the remediation work the building needed. Devin's engineering background made him invaluable on the assessment. He found a load-bearing issue in the back corner that, once disclosed, dropped the price another $15,000. In March, Brendan Osei signed the papers on the Prue building. The work started immediately. Brendan could no longer operate from the old shop. The municipal order had effectively ended that, and Hargrove Capital's lawyers had, through a separate instrument, filed to terminate the lease effective April 1st. He had moved his tools and his records and the 2 cars currently in build to a rented storage facility in February. He'd told his customers what was happening, as plainly as he could. Most of them waited. A few didn't. He drove out to the Prue building every morning at 6 and didn't leave until 7 or 8 at night. Devin had taken a semester's leave from Lakehead to help with the build-out. They did the demolition themselves, tearing out old workbenches and outdated electrical panels, stripping the interior back to concrete and steel. A plumber, Brendan, had restored a 1954 Chevy truck for ran new drain lines at cost. An electrician whose father had been a regular customer upgraded the panel and ran the heavy-gauge circuits for the lifts. An HVAC contractor who had been trying to get Brendan to look at his '67 Mustang for 2 years put in the spray booth ventilation system in exchange for a significant discount on that restoration once the facility was running. The local paper ran a story in April. A photographer came out and took a picture of Brendan and Devin standing inside the building, dust on their clothes, the space huge and raw around them. The headline was something modest and local, something about a Kenora business owner expanding operations. But the story got picked up by an automotive enthusiast blog based in Toronto, and that version spread further. It mentioned Victoria Hargrove and the lease dispute and the town compliance order. It mentioned that Osei Restoration was rebuilding in a space 5 times larger than its original location. Comments started coming in, emails, phone calls. People who had heard about Brendan's work, or read his father's name in old automotive journals, or simply read the story and wanted to be part of whatever happened next. A man named Dennis Tremblay, a retired aerospace engineer from Ottawa who collected pre-war vehicles, called to ask if Brendan would take on a 1937 Packard 12. The car had been sitting in a climate-controlled garage for 40 years, barely touched since a partial restoration in the 80s that had used the wrong materials throughout. It needed everything done properly from scratch. Dennis had been told by 3 shops in Toronto and 1 in Montreal that the project was too complex, too expensive, and too risky. Brendan said, "When can you bring it up?" Dennis paused. "You're actually open?" "We'll be taking delivery in July," Brendan said. "We're building the facility right now." There was a long pause. Then Dennis said, "I've been trying to find someone for this car for 6 years. The Packard was the first commission for what Brendan was now calling, quietly, Osei Coachworks. The name had been Devin's idea. It felt right. It was something bigger than a shop. By June, the facility was close enough to functional that they could begin work. The spray booth went in first, a proper downdraft unit, the kind that competition-level restoration shops ran. Then the 4-post lift and 2 scissor lifts, then the rotisserie mounting points, then the fabrication corner with a welding station and an English wheel that Brendan had found at an estate auction in Sault Ste. Marie and spent 2 weekends refurbishing. Devin built the parts cleaning and storage system himself, with the kind of methodical precision that reminded Brendan, sometimes physically painfully, of Joelle, who had approached every project in their house the same way. The tools from the old shop went up on the new walls. Brendan arranged them the same way his father had, in the same order, with the same logic. It took a full Saturday. Devin didn't say anything, he just helped. The photograph of Kwame went up above the main workstation. Same position as always. Kwame Osei, 1984, standing in front of something he'd built, grinning. Denny Tremblay arrived in early July with the Packard on a covered trailer. He was 71 years old, a small, precise man with white hair and the careful hands of someone who had spent his career working in tolerances measured in millimeters. He walked around his car for a long time after the trailer was opened, the way people walk around things they've been worrying about from a distance. Then he walked around the facility. "I had a friend in Toronto tell me this place didn't exist yet," Dennis said. "That I was taking a risk." "Your friend was right," Brendan said. 3 months ago, this was a shell. Dennis looked at the English wheel, looked at the spray booth, looked at the tools on the wall, arranged with evident care, the photograph above the station. How long for the Packard? 14 months. Could be 16. I won't give you a number I can't keep. Dennis nodded. My last shop gave me a number they couldn't keep. 18 months became 4 years and the car came back wrong. I know, Brendan said. I've fixed work like that before. I won't be the person who creates it. Dennis put out his hand. Brendan shook it. The Packard stayed. There were hard months. The financing costs were significant and the revenue from the first projects came slowly, the way it always does when you're doing it right. Brendan ate into savings more than he'd planned. There was a week in September when the furnace at the facility failed and he spent 4 days working in temperatures that made his hands ache and his breath fog, waiting on a part that was back-ordered from Calgary. He didn't complain about it to anyone except Devin, and only once late on a Tuesday night when they were both exhausted and eating takeout on the facility floor. This is the hard part, Devin said. I know, it gets lighter, I know that too. Brendan looked at his son across the concrete floor in the industrial lighting, surrounded by the machines and tools of a business that was just beginning to become what it was supposed to be. Devin was 20 years old. He had Joel's eyebrows and Kwame's hands and some third thing, some particular quality of steadiness, that belonged entirely to himself. Your grandfather would like this place, Brendan said. Devin looked up at the photograph above the workstation. Yeah, he said, he'd like the English wheel especially. Brendan laughed. It was the first time he'd laughed in weeks. It felt like a door opening. In October, Phyllis Garner called with news she'd been following for months. Hargrove Capital's waterfront development had hit a significant obstacle. The environmental assessment required for the marina expansion had flagged contamination in the lakebed sediment at the proposed dock location, contamination that predated Hargrove's acquisition of the property, and that she was now legally responsible for remediating before any construction could proceed. The cost estimates were substantial. The timeline had expanded by at minimum 2 years. 2 of the institutional investors backing the hospitality corridor had begun withdrawal proceedings. There was more. The complaint that had triggered the initial inspection of Osei Restoration, the one that had started everything, had been traced, through a Freedom of Information request that Phyllis had quietly filed 8 months ago to a numbered company registered in Toronto. The numbered company's directors, when you followed the chain of corporate registration through 3 layers, included a name that appeared on Hargrove Capital's own corporate filing as a senior operations officer. Phyllis was calm when she explained all of this because that was how Phyllis explained everything. But the implication was clear. Can we do anything with this? Brendan asked. The FOI disclosure doesn't prove intent, Phyllis said. Not on its own. But it establishes a pattern that a civil claim could use, and the Municipal Licensing Office has already been made aware of the connection, informally at this point, but they're not pleased. Brendan thought about it. He thought about the legal costs, the time, the energy. Let me ask you something, he said. If I pursue this, what does it do to her? Reputational exposure, Phyllis said. Regulatory scrutiny. It would complicate her remaining financing relationships. Whether it results in formal sanctions depends on what the licensing office decides to do and if I don't pursue it. Then she carries on, perhaps more carefully. Brendan was quiet for a moment. File the civil claim, he said. Not for the money, for the record. Phyllis said she'd begin the paperwork. The civil claim was filed in November and became, as these things often do in small cities, a matter of local conversation. The Kenora paper covered it. The automotive blog in Toronto covered it again. A business reporter from a Winnipeg outlet picked it up and wrote a longer piece about the pattern of corporate land assembly tactics in mid-sized Canadian towns. Hargrove Capital as one example among several, a case study in how regulatory mechanisms could be weaponized by parties with the legal resources to exploit them. Victoria Hargrove did not publicly respond. Her communications firm issued a brief statement about the matter being without merit. The Kenora Licensing Office opened a formal review of the circumstances surrounding the initial complaint. Meanwhile, in the facility on the eastern edge of town, the 1937 Packard 12 was coming apart panel by panel. Brendan had never worked on a car like it. The Packard 12 was a car from a different age, an age when automobiles were built as objects of art, when coach builders in Detroit and Toronto and London constructed bodies by hand, shaping aluminium and steel over wooden bucks, stitching interiors by hand, fitting glass with the care of jewelers. The previous restoration had damaged some of the original metalwork. There were panels that had to be entirely remade, not repaired, not patched, but fabricated from scratch in the original gauge and profile. Brendan had done this work before, but never at this scale. He spent 3 weeks on a single door panel, hammering, shaping, checking, comparing against the original profile, starting again. Dennis came up from Ottawa twice during the winter to see progress. He was quiet, careful with his observations, but Brendan could see it in the way the older man moved through the space. He was watching something be done right for the first time. Devon returned to Lakehead in January but drove up most weekends. He was working on his thesis, something related to materials science and corrosion resistance, and he'd begun talking with Brendan about techniques that could be applied to the shop's restoration work. New approaches to primer chemistry, rust encapsulation, the application of aerospace-grade sealants to internal cavities. The work at the shop was informing his thesis. The thesis was feeding back into the shop. A second major commission arrived in February, a 1952 Hudson Hornet from a collector in Calgary, shipped to Kenora at significant expense because the collector's restoration advisor had specifically recommended Osei Coachworks. The advisor turned out to be Dennis Tremblay, who had apparently told 6 people about the Packard project before it was even finished. Word of mouth is slow and then it is not. The civil case moved at the speed of civil cases, which is to say unhurriedly. There were filings, responses, procedural motions, a mediation session in the spring that produced nothing. Brendan attended what he had to attend and let Phyllis manage the rest. He had stopped thinking about Victoria Hargrove as the central fact of his situation. She had been for a while, she wasn't anymore. The central facts now were the Packard and the Hudson and the 1969 Camaro Z28 that a Sudbury businessman had brought up in April after seeing a photograph of the facility on the automotive blog, and Devon, who was finishing his degree and had begun quietly to move toward a decision about what happened next, and the photograph of Kwame above the workstation, and the English wheel in the corner, which was becoming, in Brendan's hands, an instrument he was beginning to understand the way you understand a language. Not just competently, but with something approaching fluency. And the facility itself, which smelled like metal and paint and cold concrete and motor oil, which were the smells of his entire life, which were the smells of his father's hands. The settlement offer came in June, 14 months after Brendan had signed the papers on the Prue building. He was in the middle of a fitting on the Packard's rear quarter panel, a panel he'd spent 6 weeks making, which was now finally sitting in its proper position on the body, with a gap so even and a surface so true that Dennis Tremblay, when he came up to see it, had stood in silence for almost a full minute before he spoke. Phyllis called while he had his hands on the panel. He stepped away to take it. The offer was significant. Hargrove Capital was proposing to settle the civil claim for an amount that would, net of legal costs, effectively cover every expense Brendan had incurred in the move, the build-out, the months of reduced revenue, and the financing costs on the Prue property. It was not an admission of wrongdoing. It was, the accompanying letter stated, a commercial decision. Brendan stood in the middle of his facility and looked around, looked at the Packard, its rear quarter finally right after 6 weeks, looked at the Hudson under its cover in the second bay, looked at the tools on the wall in his father's order, looked at the photograph. He called Phyllis back. "Take it," he said. "You understand it's not an admission." "I know what it is," Brendan said. "Take it." After he hung up, he stood there for another minute. He wasn't thinking about Victoria Hargrove. He wasn't particularly thinking about the money. He was thinking about a conversation he'd had with his father years ago when he was a teenager and had asked why Kwame had come to Kenora of all places, a small city in northwestern Ontario, hours from anywhere. Kwame had thought about it in the way he thought about serious questions, which was slowly and with his whole attention. "Because nobody there expected me," he'd said finally. "When nobody expects you, anything you build is a surprise, and I like surprising people." Brendan went back to the panel. He pressed his palm flat against the metal, feeling the surface, reading it the way you read something that matters. He had more work to do. The Packard 12 was completed the following October, 16 months after Dennis Tremblay had unloaded it from the trailer in front of a building that had still smelled of empty space and old welds. Dennis drove up from Ottawa with his wife, a woman named Claire who had never shown much interest in cars and who stood in the facility looking at the Packard for a long time with an expression that wasn't automotive enthusiasm but something else, a recognition of something made with care, which is a different and perhaps more universal thing. "It's exactly right," Dennis said. He said it quietly, not to Brendan particularly, but to the car. "I've been looking at photographs of this car my whole life. It's exactly right." Brendan loaded it onto a covered trailer bound for an invitational concours event in Montreal where it was being entered for evaluation. He'd never entered a car in a show before. He didn't know how it would go. He'd done the work he knew how to do, and he'd done it completely, and the rest was outside his control, which was a description that applied to quite a lot of life. Devon was there that morning. He'd come back to Kenora permanently that summer, formally joining the business, with a plan they'd drawn up together over 2 evenings at the kitchen table. A 10-year outline for what Osei Coachworks could become, written in the same kitchen where Joelle had read the paper on a Tuesday morning, where Kwame had laughed about Kenora winters, where Brendan had sat alone with a glass of water on the worst night of his life, and again on the night before the bank meeting, and again on the night he signed the papers for the Prue building. The trailer pulled out. They watched it go. "What do you think?" Devin asked. Brendan looked at the road, the empty trailer space where the Packard had been. "I think your grandfather would have liked that car," he said. Devin smiled. "I think he would have liked the whole thing, Dad." The morning light was coming off the lake the way it always did in October in Kenora, flat and gold and particular to this place. The facility behind them was full of work. There were 3 more cars waiting. There were calls to return and decisions to make and a business to run, a real one, the kind with weight and consequence. Brendan Osei turned back toward the building that used to be the Prue property and walked through the door that used to open onto empty space and went back to work.